One of the biggest issues that we have in today's world, at least when you ask people, is the job market. From employers having basically carte blanche, do whatever they want to you, to unlivable wages, to the difficulty of getting a job in the first place. It is really looking grim out there. And for a lot of people, it's only going to get worse. But you know what's stopping that? Your rights as a worker and your willingness to use them, organizing into labor unions, and actually reporting your employers for misconduct and poor behavior. And since things are getting worse, clearly that means everyone is going to start joining up and starting to. Oh, what? Membership is going down? Man, fuck you guys. Let's talk labor rights on why are you talking about this? Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Waytat. I'm your host, William, and I will be your guide through the agonizing world of labor rights today. I mostly labor wrongs, let's be real here. But before we do that, I just want to thank you so much for listening. Even if it's because you've been working a 13-hour shift for 3 days in a row, and this is the only audio available that's left before you start listening to mommy ASMR. Which I gotta question why you picked this over that, but hey, I appreciate your choice, even if it's objectively wrong. Anyways, we do not have a whole lot in terms of updates, at least for this show. Just same old with the shoutouts, and making sure to follow Mystic Luna and my friend Win Kashika. Those are going to be especially important with the way that the world is going right now. Um, I okay. The full transparency. The other update I have is I'm considering expanding the podcast family into a third show. So I mean, if you want that to be a thing, let me know. But can we just absolutely level for a second? What the fuck is going on right now? Like, why is uh? I have heard of backsliding, but this is like backing it up. Um, yeah, let's go to the show. Okay, so we're going to be talking about labor rights, which, if you didn't know this already, means your rights. That's right, your rights. You specifically. I'm pointing to you right now. Don't look behind you. You'll scare the shit out of yourself. Because unless you own and operate a business, or are an independent contractor, or you're privately wealthy, labor rights apply to you. And even then, they do to some degree. But why? Well, because despite how the name may sound, labor rights are not the rights your work has. Also, despite what your employer might say. Rather, labor rights, also known as worker rights, is a combination of legal and human rights afforded to you by the virtue that you work for a living. Many of which are codified under a lot of different laws in a lot of different places all over the world, and in both national law and international law. But there are a core set of labor rights that are standard regardless of if a nation has accepted them, the culture of a place, or the level of development a place has, written by the International Labor Organization, or ILO. First is your freedom of association. And this doesn't mean that you can be friends with and or fuck whoever you want at work. Although if you and Janice and accounting want to get at it after hours, as long as it's not company property, I don't think they really have any grounds to say anything about that. But this is more about joining trade unions and organize. But this is more about joining and organizing unions than personal relationships. You're always allowed to do so and don't have to join the one set up by the government or your employer. Second is your right of collective bargaining, where you have the ability to use the union to negotiate higher wages for your entire team than having the campaign alone, which in combination, as an American, you're probably already cringing in fear. Third is that you can't be forced to work through any means of enslavement, through any means or enslavement for any reason. I mean, besides money. And here's the thing. You might be thinking American prison system, but technically they do get paid. It's just not enough to actually mean anything and be essentially enough money to sometimes buy something from commissary. And we have to start your moral argument about why a structure exists in society with technically not slavery. You're probably in the wrong. Fourth is the elimination of the worst of child labor, meaning children cannot be exposed to unsafe conditions, have to be a minimum age to work, and cannot work beyond a certain number of hours, depending on the job in the country, or in the US, the state. Which is very frustrating that the number one enemy of this law isn't dictators or fascists or the billionaires, but shift managers in fast food restaurants. And finally is non-discrimination in employment. Basically, equal pay for equal work and opportunity for advancement for everyone. And if you just see those and think that those are your only rights, then you would be wrong. I mean, maybe. Those are just the rights everyone has to pretend to follow because otherwise they'll get a slap on the wrist. But there's other labor rights that you have, such as your right to hour limits. That you have the right to go home, have weekends, and have a limit to the number of hours you're working. Because otherwise you could be forced to work 18-hour shifts 7 days a week if your employer wanted to. And workplace conditions, which allow you to work in a safe and healthy environment and continues to expand that. Also, safety and social sustainability, like preventing human trafficking, elimination of child labor, promoting workers' rights, and sustainable and ethical sourcing of products and services. Also, having a living wage for all employees, giving pregnant workers the right to keep their job and go on maternity leave, protecting migrant and undocumented workers from abuse and exploitation, and globalizing labor rights, giving everyone worldwide equal rights so that large multinational corporations can't find the place with the least labor protections so they can charge you exorbitant amounts of money for something that took relative pennies to produce. You know the companies like Apple and all of them. But yes, these are all rights that you have. And if you're starting to get nervous, realizing that these rights get bent over more than a hentai character, and you've been entirely unaware, good, you're starting to realize what the problem is. But if you're in the US, what are your rights, specifically? Well, I mean, I can tell you as of today, I don't know if this will be around for much longer, but it does depend on what kind of worker you fall under. So everyone has the benefit from the Wages and Fair Labor Standard Act, granting a federal minimum wage and forcing everyone to pay the higher minimum wage between federal and state. And by the way, that hasn't changed since 2009, and it's $7.25 an hour, which is bonkers low. I make 21 an hour and I am still struggling. I don't know how some of you people do it. Oh, but if it's a tip profession, your minimum wage is actually lower than that. So, wait staff, get fucked. But also, non-salary employees with no other exemptions are allowed to receive 1.5 times your pay overtime whenever you go over 40 hours a week. But there is no federal limit on the hours that you can work at one time, assuming you're at least 16. Which incentivizes employers to limit your work time in the place that hurts them the most. The wallet. The FLSA also requires employers to have accurate pay and time records and make child labor illegal. Also, everyone gets FMLA, family and medical leave, which gives you 26 weeks to care for people that are service members and a direct family member, and also 12 weeks of unpaid job protection for reasons of like childbirth, adoption, to care for someone with a serious health condition if you have a serious health condition, or you're the family of a service member. And bet your goddamn ass your employer does not want you to do this. Of course, you probably don't either, given it's unpaid, but basically, they can't fire you if you have a serious condition. And sure, you could argue up the number of weeks, but if you're unable to work for about a quarter of the year and you need more time, I think you should be applying for something else besides FMLA. But all workers have a few other additional protections, like against wrongful termination, being fired due to discrimination, reported on or refusing to be involved in harassment. Uh, but all workers have a few other protections, like wrongful termination, which would be being fired due to discrimination, being reporting on or refusing to be involved in harassment, refusing to or reporting on illegal or unsafe working environments, or in violation of federal or state labor laws. Although there is also at will laws, which is basically that unless under contract, union, or government work, you can't be fired at you can be fired at any time without a reason, unless it's retaliation or discrimination, like we just said. Also, workers get workers' comp if they experience injury or illness due to their job, including payments while injured, medical expenses, and benefits to dependents if you die at work. So again, your employer has extra reason to make sure that you don't die. Workplaces also have to be safe, including protection from toxic chemicals, using PPE, safe machines in workspaces, the right to refuse working somewhere unsafe. That is a big one. You need to be doing that constantly. And be able to be trained in a language you understand for workplace safety and health training. However, each state also has their own set of laws for these things as well, which can sometimes be really fucking shitty. Alabama. But if you're a seasonal agricultural worker or a migrant worker, you also get the MSPA, which establishes employment standards for farm labor contractors and farm labor employees to register and obtain authorization. It basically requires all work and transportation vehicles are both safe and insured, that your housing meets safety and health standards, that you maintain accurate payroll and hours records, and provides written information about the working environment and compensation. If you're an H-2B worker, you're basically a non-migrant doing a temporary labor or service, then you have similar protections to above. So no pulling a guitar or literally any corporation if they could, where they take your passport until you stop being useful. And yes, that happens. And we have this because the US has a pretty well used strategy for seasonal and migrant workers where you come to the US temporarily, help us out with something, usually farming, and then go home with a good amount of money, and the person hiring you doesn't have to shell out everything they'd have to hire Americans. On a larger ethical national scale, is this scummy? Kinda. For everyone involved, is this technically a win? Yeah. Now, besides the government, who else is meant to protect these labor laws, and how exactly did a lot of them get put in place? Well, both have the same answer: labor unions, i.e., you and your coworkers. Technically. Kind of. See, labor unions are groups of workers that band together to negotiate with their employer, since a group of employees is more able to twist their employer's arm compared to a single worker. However, a lot of unions are larger and national unions that have decades of history existing. But okay, so let's pretend that you're listening to this and you're just an absolute fucking chud or Elon Musk. And first of all, stop with the Nazi shit before you get shot. But what would be the pros and cons of labor rights? Also, if you are a chud, you really gotta have some class consciousness, my guy. Like, this is literally about you. On the good side of labor law, we first have increased access to fair wages, safety, prevention of discrimination, and worker safety nets, which should really be all that you need to be in favor. You're a worker, right? You're a human with empathy, right? You understand that human suffering is a bad thing, right? I mean, I did say that I was addressing Musk, so, if you don't do it, you're cringe. I don't know, is that the fucking thing that I have to. Are those the magic words that make you behave? Anyways, secondly, having these rights and standards increases economic stability and growth and massively reduces income inequality, which again creates more stability, which means your economy is more powerful and can survive hardships. Third, your productivity goes up because people work harder and better when they feel secure and fairly treated. I mean, you can still pay them table scraps. You don't have to shell out your immense dragon hoard. Us normal people just want to be financially stable and happy. Also, by having minimum standards, you and all your competitors are on an even field, making business competition both more ethical and less exploitative, but also all on the same playing field. Like your competitor that can't be fucked to care about worker safety can't just cut corners anymore to compete with you because that'll cost them money. On the good side of unions, they provide better working conditions and job security. Employees also get a way to voice and address complaints, and unions give employees more of a voice in politics because unions support political candidates. And all this acts as a shield to keep the greedy and or ambitious and or stupid dickheads in your organization from getting you fined by the government. But trust me, I have heard some boss stories. There's people who are so aggressively stupid they would get your company shut down if it wasn't for the union. But on the bad side, labor laws do increase business costs. Boo-hoo, suck it up, shit-nose. But labor laws can also reduce flexibility of organizations in terms of hiring, firing, and management, which reduces business growth. Again, boo-hoo. Labor laws can also open up the door for increased lawsuits against employers, which can be scary for them, even though they tend to be favored for employment law and can cause them to lose money or maybe even reputation based on the actions of either a single middle manager, misunderstandings, or deeply seated poor behavior that no one wants to address, because if they did, it would cost them money and upset their power players. You know, the rich old executives that still think women and the gays can't work and have views about minorities that make a Klansman blush. Some also argue that having labor laws can reduce the number of jobs because companies are less likely to hire and become pickier. Which is happening, but it's not because of labor laws. It's because companies suck but don't blow. But of course, the other bad thing is the potential for unintended side effects, like companies abandoning full time workers in favor of part time to avoid giving full time benefits. Like Walmart. For unions, they tend to be pretty expensive for employers to invite or establish, and they also ask for dues from employees, which can leave a sour taste in their mouths. Also, union members have to agree with the union's choices, even if they disagree and the individual members are unable to really negotiate or counter or contradict their union. And unions can make it harder to fire, promote, or hire someone and prioritize seniority over experience, education, or talent. And finally, unions often cause a lot of legal costs and tend to slow stuff down because of high litigations and negotiations if you have a good one. Unless, of course, your employer is decent and wants to give you and your coworkers something nice. So, I mean, really, the upside of labor laws and unions is that they stop you from being exploited. The downside is that to stop you from being exploited takes a lot of resources and money and time and also a lot of litigation. So, take some leave. So, I mean, good with the bad, I guess. But we are on to the history section. So, because the history of labor rights is very long and jumps around place to place a lot, and also workers' rights weren't really a thing for the majority of world history, a lot of this is going to be focused on England, the first industrialized Western nation, and guilds, the predecessors of unions and the labor movement. Does that sound good? Good. I wasn't listening, so I don't know. So before the Middle Ages, in Western Europe, the closest we had to guilds would be the Roman Collegium, one of the earliest conceptualizations of organized collaborative labor. Eventually, this just became the term for an illegally recognized organization, but this level of organization really only became a big thing again in the Middle Ages, where after a combination of the Black Death, urbanization, and increased distribution and increasingly distributed systems of power, organized groups of craftsmen became more and more powerful, which eventually resulted in the rise of guilds to protect craft people from their prices getting undercut or the government getting their filthy fingies into their pockets and brain. And guild membership was often centered around cities and highly populated or rich areas, where guilds upheld rigid systems of rank and power within the guild with high quality requirements and stringent controls on craftsmen. While across most of the world, guilds became and remained powerful for hundreds of years, they were already worn. They were already waning in England by 1562 with the passing of the Statute of Artificers, which shifted control of wages and employment away from guilds and to the local authorities. And was this because the guilds had a history of at times being run like the mob, or because they charged too much for their goods, or maybe because the big bad stinky English government was trying to grind the little guy's balls into paste? No, it's because the Weavers Guild was fucking over their workers and underpaying them. Good job, England. And I mean that legitimately for once. Followed immediately by Bad Job, England. Stop shitting on the carpet. Because by 1757, they once again abandoned wage regulation, instead accepting a laissez-faire economic style, which basically means whatever goes, goes. Meanwhile, MP John Wilkes, without the booth, establishes himself in politics, appealing to workers through popular press and public meetings while advocating for increased rights, voting power for the working class, and an end to corruption. However, his platform of workers' rights and reforms is ended pretty quickly. As in 1768, he's imprisoned for criticizing the king, God bless America, which leads to his followers protesting and then being massacred at St. George Fields. Ah, classic English behavior. Also in the late 1700s, guilds begin to massively lose their power in England and die off. However, trade unions emerge, which is essentially just guilds to Electric Boogaloo. However, throughout this era, a variety of strikes and riots established trade unions as the workers began to band together. Like the 1751 Wool Combers Union, weavers strike in 1765, 1769, nice, and 1773 until local justices were allowed to fix wages. Also, the Hatter, Shipwright, and Cutler clubs slowly became unions. And after the French Revolution, the English became even more radicalized, which is a phrase that's only scarier when it's the Irish. With things like Thomas Paine's The Right of Man being published and the Reading and Debate Club London Corresponding Society focus on the working class being established. Becoming terrified of these things, the government performs large-scale political repression, which is, of course, the third most popular English hobby besides stabbings and eating crayons. But with that, a lot of the LCS's members were arrested. Paine was also forced to leave the country, and Scottish reformers were sent to the colonies. Furthering the hobby, in 1795, the Two Acts Pass, which makes certain words acts of treason, like cunt, requiring a license to do public speaking engagement, and limiting public gatherings to groups of 50 or less. And, well, holy shit, as an American, this makes me want to overthrow a government. By 1799, the LCS was outlawed, and forming unions was made illegal until partway into the 19th century. In 1805, Scottish weavers went on strike, demanding that those over 2-century-old wage laws were enforced. 3 weeks later, their leaders were arrested, and 3 years after that, the minimum wage bill failed in Parliament, which pissed off the workers again enough that they reorganized and caused massive factory district strikes until their pay was increased by 20%. Presumably, they either won or were shot. Maybe both. In 1811, in response to declining standards of living, the Luddites in Nottinghamshire, God, British names fucking below, began to sabotage and destroy their own machines, essentially protesting and causing massive costs to their employers while remaining relatively decentralized and secret. And guess what? They won. Really makes you think, doesn't it? Anyways, the next year, the first radical socialist pro-labor society is formed, the Society of Spencean Philanthropists in London. It really only had much of a presence in England rather than going international, but increased massively after the Napoleonic Wars. When then the Corn Laws are passed, creating massive restrictions and tariffs on imported food, which basically just increased the cost of living for poor people, which again resulted in mass rioting and caused a ton of working class newspapers, reformation clubs, and organizations to form. It's almost like bullying the poor people is a bad idea. Then in 1817, during a speech by Henry Hunt, the Muncher of. I mean, you know where I was going with that. The Spenceans started what would become known as the Sapfields Riots, which led to crackdowns and eventually the Gagging Act. And eventually the Gagging Acts, which suspended habeas corpus, banned public assembly, and repressed Spenceans. Not as fun as the Gagging Act sounds like it would be. In process of this, there was a march on London, which failed. But from this point on, the British government started to crack down on and disrupt labor movements from the inside. Despite this, though, the rest of the 1810s and 1820s, laborers continued to organize and form unions. However, the government continued to fight back, but by 1838, the labor unions were starting to win. The Chartism movement begins, being one of the world's first global labor movements, and they wanted 6 things: suffrage for men 21 and older, voting by secret ballot, equal sized electoral districts, pay for parliament members, ending the requirement to own property to be in parliament, and annual parliament elections. And while the movement died, the UK did adopt the first 5 reforms. And they finally achieved a strong victory when the International Workingmen's Association is founded in London in 1864, finally giving unions international power and giving them a much stronger power base, essentially forcing them into English life. So now let's see how the Americans were doing with their labor unions. And going back in time to 1768, before we're even a country, we've already had a strike. This was in New York and was against the reduction of wages for tailors, and they won. In 1794, the first trade union is founded in Philadelphia, the Federal Society of Journeyman Cordwangers. Yep, you fucking heard that shit right. Cordwainers. And their job? Jerking off dogs. No, just kidding. That's a stupid fucking way to say shoemaker. But this marks the beginning of consistent and ever-present trade unions in the U.S. And due to the power and influence as the U.S.'s trade unions expanded and more popped up, they were able to hold their own against the Industrial Revolution. Unlike England. In 1827, the Mechanics' Union of Trade Associations forms, and in the 1830s, the working men's parties are started, which advocate for equal rights and reform efforts. Many labor groups were founded on the concepts that went into the foundations of the U.S., including justice, social equality, honest labor, and independent and virtuous citizens. And the U.S. unions, by 1852, learned the same lessons as the UK unions, forming the International Typographical Union with workers from the U.S. and Canada. Which, I gotta say, it feels very weird, but also really nice to have an episode for once where the US is doing something right at this point in history. Very rarely do we visit any point in history where the US is doing something where we can applaud them. Besides World War, well, I was gonna say World War II, but we did a lot of things we shouldn't be happy about. Yeah, no, this is the first time. Although I do need to rain on the parade a little bit. See, up until this point, all of these unions, they were for skilled workers, not us plebeians. So we just had to deal with whatever the fuck was going to happen to us. But into the 1860s, with the National Labor Union and the Knights of Labor, both these motherfuckers we have talked about before, by the way, becoming prominent, a new movement began of labor reformers who wanted better labor conditions and trade unions that wanted to represent their trade's best interest. By the mid 1880s, however, the difference between them essentially vanished, with workers from both labor unions and reformers joining the side of Reformation to get what they wanted to get done. In 1886, when the Knights of Labor started twisting arms with national labor unions to conform to them, these unions combined together into the American Federation of Labor, which took the masses from labor reformers and gave them to trade unions, which caused the supremacy of the trade union. And with socialist and communist underpinnings being necessary for the revolution, and with socialist and communist underpinnings of the idea of trade unions being necessary for the revolution, the AFL taught pure and simple unionism, which is only by self-organization across occupational lines and by focusing on job-conscious goals could workers be emancipated. Basically translating in English, the only way we're getting out of this shit is if we all grab shovels and dig together. And this was regardless of any background factor, skill, or origin, which is a welcome change. And then the 1892 Homestead strike occurs in Pennsylvania, which happened because skilled steel mill workers went on strike after management broke their union rules, despite negotiating for the union to put those rules in place, which caused a massively bloody battle that we are still trying to unpack and sort out the trauma of to this day. Which is really saying something for 1892. 3 years later, the immense pressure the AFL was under eventually broke them. See, while they had tried to unionize everyone, some industries resisted in the less skilled fields. Instead, highly skilled workers often organized around them, who were often heavily divided on racial, ethnic, and gender lines, aka were middle-class white men, which meant that the AFL had to conform to them, meaning that they founded the all-white International Association of Mechanists. And from there, the ban on non-white members only spread. After being ignored and their goals dismissed, the AFL begins to ally with partisan politics, throwing their lot in with both major parties and clinging to whoever could get their goals furthered. However, each time they succeeded, their critics on the other side would threaten the relationship. So, they began to abandon partisanship, and eventually they became inactive by the early 1900s. And then, a tragedy happened that would forever change labor law. In August of 1911, the Triangle Shirtwaist factory caught fire. With this fire started near the top of the building, workers couldn't escape because the owners had fucking locked the fire escapes, and the firefighters' ladders couldn't reach the top of the building. So workers began jumping out to their deaths. And this fire, and the deaths that occurred with it, which I believe was 136, and the events afterwards led to massive workplace reforms. And then during the Great Depression, with these changing labor laws, the continued discontentment of industrial workers, and New Deal bargaining legislation, craft unions began to move away from the AFL, which refocused the government to focus much heavier on labor laws and protecting workers, which allowed for the 1935 founding of the Committee for Industrialized which allowed for the 1935 founding of the Committee for Industrial Organization, aiding the auto, rubber, steel, and other industrial unions, and was established as the Congress of Industrial Organizations. And by the end of World War II, over 12 million workers belonged. And by the end of World War II, over 12 million workers belonged to unions. However, by 1948, being filled with conservative membership and fearing witch hunts, they expelled their left-wing membership and opposed the Progressive Party by 1948, and by 1955, the CIO and AFL merge to advance the economic and labor interests of union membership, and collective bargaining becomes one of the key features of labor unions. But despite all of that, from 1945 to 1970, unions create insanely strong security against things like old age, illness, injury, and they create safety nets for workplace safety, protect workers, secure unemployment, and increase wages. And in the 60s, the public and service sectors become unionized as well, and the defense of racial and gender equality becomes strengthened largely because of that. However, this does create some uneasiness as these groups become powerful and in squashing distance of the AFL-CIO. Yet, surprisingly, this organization becomes the cornerstone of the civil rights movement, aiding the movement despite being largely white. And when those passed, a lot of labor unions on the more leftist side quietly cheered, happy that the AFL-CIO was on the mend. But of course, this is America. We can't let things go well or learn our lesson from our mistakes. So, at the beginning of the 70s, the communications and transportation industries are heavily dysregulated, and goods importing becomes many times more popular than making things at home, which in combination cuts unions down at the knee. And then in 1978, the National Labor Relations Act is reformed to intentionally hamstring the power of labor unions. And this is all before the 80s, when Ronald goddamn motherfucking Reagan introduces the most anti-union administration seen since World War II, ushering us into the modern era of shit show unions. So let's go talk about that now. Alright, so where are we at with labor laws? Are they effective? And are we getting better? Well, let's start with the stats for injury, illness, and charges brought against companies. So in 2024, the number of charges was up from the previous year, at about 1,500 more for about 21,300 cases the whole year, nationwide. Now, of that, 4,625 were withdrawn, which is down from 2023, but 3,923 were dismissed, which is up by almost 500. 6,313 of them were settled or adjusted, which is again up, and only about 141 were actually closed. Which basically means that out of all those charges, just over 8,000 of them didn't even make it to court. However, a total of 5,235 ended in settlements being reached, which means that they weren't settled out of court or adjusted, and the companies had to actually pay out. And how much did corporations pay out? About $56.5 million, with only $300K of that being fees and fines, and most of it being back pay. So what does this tell us? Well, it seems to tell us that companies are being sued more often for breaking labor laws, and about half of them get resolved and pay out to the person affected. Which sounds bad, but that's actually trending upwards. In our favor, the workers. Working out even more for us is that workplace injuries and illness are down as of 2023. For every 100 workers overall, only 2.4 are injured, which is down 0.3. And of those workers, 1.5 of them needed to take time off, transfer, or be placed on a work restriction. And unsurprisingly, the most dangerous would be transportation and warehouse, having 4.5 injuries per 100 workers, and even more unsurprisingly, being that finance and insurance is at 0.3 per 100 workers. Which makes sense because the most dangerous parts of the job are carpal tunnel and rogue staplers. But hey, all around, pretty good news. But we should also mention union membership. Between 2023 and 2024, union membership overall dropped to 9.9% from 10%. And union coverage dropped to 11.1% from 11.2%. Yeah, union membership is dropping, but not rapidly. However, while all age groups and most ethnic backgrounds, except for the Asian demographic, have decreasing union memberships by about the same amount, the union membership that's really on the rise is part-time workers, up 0.2% in a year. As far as coverage goes, it's increasing for young workers and decreasing for all other age groups, and ethnically, it's net going up, but white and Hispanic union coverage is dropping. Same with full-timers, but part-timers are increasing in coverage by an astounding 0.7%, which is only an impressive size by comparison. Like me, going to the micropenis meetup just to flex. Of course, union membership in no field goes above 12%, with the highest being full-timers being union covered at that exact cap. But okay, let's also check out how much workers are being compensated. For business compensation, it's up 4.3%, while manufacturing it's up 1.7%. Unless you account for inflation, then it's actually 1.5 to 1.6, and manufacturing is actually receiving a 1% drop in compensation. However, in manufacturing, the hours worked has dropped by about 0.5%, and for business sectors, it's increased by almost 1%. So with all of that, what's the effect it has on output? Because let's be fair, that's what a lot of people you start fights with are going to claim. Paying people better and compensating them fairly and having safer work environments will hurt the economy. Well, total labor productivity for business is up 1.7%, with their output raising 2.6% and the total labor cost matching it. While for manufacturing, the total productivity increased by 0.2%, while output dropped 0.3%, and labor costs increased at 1.5%. So what's the takeaway? Shit sucks if you're in manufacturing. But besides that, labor laws aren't having any negative impact on your productivity or output. And this shouldn't have to be proven. It should just be a fact that we accept. People work better and harder when they believe in what you're doing and who they're doing it for. Why do you think every army and every movie ever has an inspiring speech section? Why do you think that also happens in real life sometimes? Because people fight harder when they believe in the company line. And you know the best way to do that? Be there for them. Like, for fuck's sake, people, this has been proven over and over and over and over again. It's as undeniable as gravity and vaccines being real and Nazis deserving to get punched in the face or killed. And if you disagree, you're not just wrong, you're stupid. But this now brings us to the issues. And while this is primarily in the US, there are also international issues. First is wage theft. Minimum wage has not kept up with housing prices, and on top of that, a lot of workers are essentially told not to think about their time off, which is a form of compensation. Not only that, but many companies routinely conduct wage theft, where numbers are rounded in their favor for pay, workers are denied overtime after the fact, or companies actively taking more money from their workers' pay than was requested for insurance, taxes, etc., and hoping they don't notice. Or reducing/changing wages on a whim. And this has been happening for decades, meaning if you've been working for 20 years, you're probably owed thousands in back pay. All of this contributes to an environment where companies steal from workers who desperately need the money out of not just a sense of greed, but trying to control their workers' lives by forcing them into doing more labor. Speaking of which, forced labor is still a massive problem in the US, because if you immigrate for work, your employer has a lot of power over you, meaning they can hold it over your head and force you to do whatever they want you to, even if you understand your rights. If you don't, they can basically tell you anything, meaning a lot of people in the US that are migrant labor are told a line of bullshit like, yes, you do need to be in this field while I spray pesticides, or I will send you back home without pay. And either you're under the assumption that they know the labor laws of their homeland better than you do, or you see through their bullshit, but who are you going to tell? The government that actively talks shit about you? Or the other farmers that might be doing the same thing? Are you going to unionize? Which, again, leads to our next point: backpedaling the right to organize. With anti union rhetoric and backpedaling Congresses trying to convince people collective bargaining and protesting is useless, whiny, or stupid, we're slowly losing our right to organize and unionize, with some companies firing you for trying, like Amazon and Starbucks. And while overall injury and illness are down at workplaces, the amount of that is heat illness, disease, and workplace violence are growing, with violence against women and minorities especially growing. Combined with OSHA's resources being strangled out and their jurisdiction increasing, they have less ability to punish companies, and the punishments are pretty weak sauce in general. Workplace injuries, especially stress injuries, are increasing, and employees more and more often on the hook for it. Because it's very hard to prove for a fact that your wrist injury was caused by doing the same repetitive wrist motions over and over again at work, when most of the protective apparatus is on traumatic or sudden onset of injury, not slow degradation over time. Our fifth issue is discrimination. Despite all advertisement, all manner of workplace discrimination has become more insidious and is actually starting to grow. From women making less to minorities and people with disabilities having a harder time getting work because companies are finding sneakier ways to deny them work, and also increasing racism, homophobia, and ableism in a variety of workplaces, all represents a pretty major threat. Especially as America leans more and more fascist. And yes, it's going to keep coming up because it keeps having to come up. And finally, the amount you're expected to work in the US to survive creates a very poor work-life balance. And because a lot of industries reinforce always being available, ignoring breaks, time off, and having constant crunch deadlines, work-life balance suffers massively, which is not how things should work. But okay, with all those issues, let's talk about how we're supposed to fix this. Alright, we're just going to jump right into it. So how do we prevent wage theft from happening to you and your family? Well, individually, in order to combat wage theft, if you suspect it's happening, do the following. First, learn your employment rights. Document your working hours, report suspected violations to the right labor agency, and consider filing a claim. If you have been a victim, take action and file a report on all wage theft, not just the theft happening to you. On a larger societal level, we need better education for people on their rights. Daddy Sam needs to crack down and increase wage enforcement strength, whip out his belt and increase punishment for perpetrators, and give employees stronger protections against wage theft. The best solution for correcting forced labor long term, besides increasing the power of enforcement apparatus, is to increase labor rights and standards, like freedom of association, giving collective bargaining power, and remediating labor abuse. Also, having free unions will heavily improve this, as employers have less power to access things to blackmail workers with, especially including migrants in the conversations. Migrant unions, or unions of farm laborers across borders, would massively increase the rights of these workers and also prevent forced labor happening to them. And in order to stop backpedaling on unionization rights, employees need more organizational rights and empowerment. Like bringing them into the conversation on decisions made for the workplace. But also create good jobs for all workers by having pay standards, hiring goals, responsibility standards, and some kind of community benefit agreement that favors the workers. And also, we should be empowering the public sector, increasing worker protections, supporting collective action and partnership between unions and the companies that they work for, so that they can have a mutually beneficial relationship while still maintaining their own purpose. Protect workers from technologies like AI and ban practices that undermine worker power. Or hey, maybe empower unions to just do all that shit for you? And for worker safety, we need to update our own safety trainings, actually participate in the safety committees and groups, make sure things are well maintained, or that they aren't used if broken, reward safe behaviors, and prevent retaliation for reporting unsafe conditions or concerns. To reduce discrimination, you need to train everyone on what constitutes discrimination. Then ensure the higher ups know how to respond to it and to do it properly. To make sure complaints are handled well and confidentially, harshly punish discrimination, and make sure the policy is clearly laid out and displayed, and make sure policies are revisited often. And on the worker side, stand up for each other and advocate. Be a good coworker and a good citizen. And finally, to ensure better work-life balances, we need to give more vacation time. Allow workers to have some actual time off and parental leave. Allow work from home when possible and flexible schedules when possible, including more part-time hours, compressed work weeks, and even some limited two-task end stuff. Very limited on that one and in the workers' favor. The workplace culture also needs a shift to prioritize well-being, outcomes, and open communication instead of profits, hours, and control. On a personal level, set boundaries and maximize your billable hours while taking breaks and communicating your needs, but also staying by your guns and actually twisting some arms and putting your money where your mouth is. But hey, you know what all of that sounds like? It sounds like having powerful unions, even if they're just in your own workplace. So then the question is, why aren't Americans joining their unions? Well, I mean, it certainly isn't because they dislike them, because the lowest approval rating is 49%, and that's college professors. And I mean, I could run down the list, but there's a lot of them, and most hover around the 60%. With only firefighter unions breaching 70, and only government, acting, and professors having a 30% disapproval. So, what's going on here? Well, I mean, let's start off with what people believe the effects are. 67% of Americans believe that under unions, wages increase, and 53% see both the power of workers and job security going up. Job satisfaction rates at 51% see an increase, 39% an increase in productivity, 31% in job number, and 23% in organizational flexibility, and 21% in ease of hiring and firing. All of these are either things that go up or are improved by unions, at least according to personal opinion. I mean, even bad side things like strike frequency and the cost of goods and services are 48% and 47% respectively. So what is going on? Why are unions on the decline when it seems like everyone hates them? When it seems like everyone likes them? Well, because I buried the lead a bit. See, when you include politics, the favor from the right drops significantly. Like the most beloved union, goes from 71% to 63% support amongst the right for firefighter unions. For professors, it drops to 32% alongside journalists, with actors and government workers also having similar reductions, and the only one with an increase being police, jumping from 56 to 63. It's almost like the right is really trying to say the quiet part out loud. I'm sure if firefighters had started putting black families into house fires, their Republican approval would skyrocket. And the effects are largely the same. Agreement on wages goes down 10%, job security 11%, worker power 10%, job satisfaction a whopping 19%, productivity goes down 15%, and an additional 13% say that prices jump up. So yes, union membership is decreasing, but it's not because we don't believe in unions. It's because right-wingers have poisoned the idea of unions. Why? Because of Ronald goddamn motherfucking Reagan. Alright, I'm gonna rant a little bit. Follow me to the soapbox. So, now that leaves my chance to fill your brain with leftist propaganda. Look, in my opinion, the backtracking and abusing our boundaries isn't an accident. We've seen the direction the US is going. It shouldn't surprise us that they're trying to shackle us to our workstations. And I'm not even going to pussyfoot and be vague. I know exactly who's doing it. It's not the fucking chuds that love Trump, although they're part of the problem. It's not some evil satanic figure. It's literally corporate interests and greed. The only thing stopping them is collecting fines and catching bans or getting audited. So how do they avoid that? Well, step one is to undermine the workers stopping them. Fund a few unions and make sure they don't do anything or actively hurt workers. Then, when new workers enter the workforce, fill their head with lies that unions only ever waste time and just take the money out of their paycheck every week to do nothing. Hell, even let the chuds run with this one. Make supporting and being part of a union make you look make you look like a whiny, ineffectual little bitch until eventually, through social pressure, unions collapse. Then you start going after labor laws. Start backtracking on the benefits employees get being with you. Slowly at first, until they realize one day that the good union jobs are gone and they don't know where they went and just complain about it instead of organizing. Then push out the weekends, trample boundaries, and cut pay and pension over and over and over again until your workers are nothing compared to your power. I mean, how do we stop this? Well, we fight back. I mean, not on the streets on this one. We're not there yet. Instead, reinforce your boundaries. Find jobs with better pay and benefits and go to them. Stop being kind or trusting your employer. Get them on everything you can. Call OSHA when they break labor laws and notify your state labor department when they fuck over someone's pay. Whenever anyone gets victimized by the company, don't cower back and be thankful it wasn't you this time. Put your whole chest out and stand up for them. Be a good worker, yes, but use that as leverage. Make sure that losing you hurts, and then whenever your company tries to hurt you or your coworkers, use that leverage. If employers won't play nice, don't play nice back. There's a time and place for honor, but that time and place isn't here, isn't now. Now is the time to fight against the death of our rights tooth and nail, because you know for a fucking fact that if they win, regardless of how honorably we fought, they won't be merciful. Let's get out of here. Nothing like thinly veiled commentary on the State of the Union while talking about the State of the Unions. Anyways, if you have opinions, advice on how to make the show better, literally the conclusion of last episode, why you disagree and love Papa Walmart's stinky cock and balls, your opinions, and really anything else you want to tell me, make sure to email me at waytatpods@gmail.com. That's waytatpods@gmail.com. And remember to check out my other podcast, Waytat Nerd, where I do basically the same thing, but with nerd topics like fantasy, sci-fi, role-playing games, etc., where I hope you like the topics just as much. And also remember to follow me on Twitter and Blue Sky at Waytat_pods for more episode announcements. Be good people, you fucking animals. Have a good night. Don't murder. Have fun. And remember, listen to this part of the last episode. You're the one with the power. Take it. This has been Why Are You Talking About This? And I've been your host, William. Good night.